Hi everyone, welcome to this week's edition of This Week in Global Development. I'm joined by our global development reporters, Ayenat and Jessie. Hi guys, thank you so much for joining us. Jessie is joining us all the way from the Bonn Climate Conference. So Jessie, we need to start with you. How is the conference? This is like a precursor to COP, right? And you were saying to me earlier, it's much smaller and easier to navigate than COP, which must be really, really nice. I find COP to be so hectic. How's the conference going, and what are sort of the main issues that people are focused on at Bonn?
Yeah. So I'm here in Bonn, and it is much smaller, much easier to talk to people, to figure out where to go to find food than COP. So it's nice, you have enough time to really dig into the issues. Um, so yeah, I'll get into kind of the main things, but I want to start with like the major news that I think is relevant to our audience just on the first 2 days. So first of all, the we all got here on Monday, but the actual negotiations didn't start until Tuesday at like 5:30 p.m. They spent the first 2 days just figuring out what to talk about, essentially, figuring out what's on the agenda. And someone told me today that this was a 17-hour delay, which is apparently a record for delaying these types of conferences. So not a great foot to start out on. And the main issue at the heart of this was finance, basically whether to include this very specific article, 9.1 of the Paris Agreement, on the agenda or not. And 9.1 refers to the provision of public finance. So that basically just means money that's coming from developed countries and going to developing countries. There's really no other part of the Paris Agreement that focuses on this bilateral funding. So it's really important to developing countries to have this. Um, but the debate about this here at Bonn was not a shock. I'm sure Ayenat will remember in Baku, the final text allocated 300 billion for climate finance, which was really seen as not nearly enough money. And a lot of the low to middle income countries were really disappointed by this. Um, and it also the 300 billion didn't specifically say like this all has to come from developed to developing countries. It could also be private finance, MDBs. And so it felt like it wasn't putting enough responsibility on the developed countries to fund this. Um, and so in Baku in November, they did ultimately agree on this, but then like it was followed up with these really admonishing statements from India, and a few other countries where they called it a paltry sum of money, and not something that will enable conducive climate action. So this sort of repeated itself yesterday at the opening plenary. They finally kind of gavelled in the final document, but it didn't have 9.1 on it. All it had was kind of a footnote at the end that said like we will continue consultations to talk about this, but it's not officially on the agenda. And ultimately, again, they allowed it to go through, but India again kind of came up and they were like, we're really upset about this. This is not the way forward. And we will be bringing this up at COP30 in Brazil in November. So before we even really got off the ground, we already have this like shadow casting itself over COP30. And just to kind of clarify, if they can't agree, or they can't figure out the consultations before COP30, this could just mean another big delay in the November climate negotiations. So I'm guessing that Brazil feels like the pressure is on here. And yeah, we'll see what happens. But that's sort of the news. I'm happy to kind of go into what else is on the agenda. Yeah.
Do you think that's an indication for COP30 that they didn't manage to get this on the agenda at Bonn? Is that an indication of what's to come at COP30 that they may not be able to get it on the agenda?
How they've been pulling strings behind the scenes, but like ultimately it was up to Azerbaijan to make this go through, and they did whatever they needed to do to make that happen. So I don't think we can yet say like, oh, maybe this is an indication that Brazil doesn't have the power we think it has to get things across the line. But I do think that it's like over the next few months, it's going to be a real sign of how effective the presidency is going to be in Brazil. And also, like I think it would be fair to say that Brazil probably wants 9.1 on that agenda, but they probably want to make sure that COP doesn't start 2 days late more. So they're really going to be acting more as like the diplomatic leader here than probably like in their own self-interest, I would imagine. But that's just me guessing.
Interesting. And what else do they have on the agenda that we should be on the lookout for?
So the other issues seem to have passed much more easily. And now we're spending the next, I don't know, 5 days or whatever, kind of discussing that, and we'll see where it goes. The top one is adaptation. So there's this big effort to figure out how to measure and quantify adaptation, which is really hard. Obviously, mitigation is much easier to measure. You say, we want to limit the temperature to this much and, remove this much carbon from the atmosphere. Like it's a little bit easier to really quantify that. But adaptation comes in all shapes and sizes. It's really hard to know how productive we're being. So right now we have 500 indicators. I think it's 490 actually, 490 indicators that that are supposed to kind of work towards measuring adaptation. And this is clearly just far too many. So the goal for COP30 in Brazil will be to slim this down to 100. Here in Bonn, a big topic of discussion is how, like, the mechanism with which they're going to slim these down. So there's a lot of talks on, like, what counts as an indicator? What might be, two indicators that really could be one indicator? And so that's a big topic of conversation. Another one is the Baku to Belém roadmap, which was something that also came out from Baku to basically low and middle income countries were saying that 300 billion that I mentioned earlier is not enough. We need 1.3 trillion to actually address the issues of climate change. And so the roadmap is a way to essentially turn the 300 billion into 1.3 trillion over the course of like a decade, and that could be through private mobilization or kind of stretching the wallet, as we see like MDBs do. And so they're working on that here as well. Again, we're not going to kind of see exactly how they're going to do that yet, but maybe we'll come out with a list of plans, a little bit more of a detailed roadmap. And the other things are, I would think, topics that people in the climate community have probably heard about many times and then just sort of forgot about them because they weren't a huge part of the rhetoric over the last year. One is the global stocktake, which I believe came out of the Dubai COP, and that's really measuring how the world is doing on its climate goals. It's kind of like a report card, and they did they created the process, but they never implemented it. So they're working on that here. Same goes for loss and damage fund. It was created, but not really been implemented. They haven't managed to get the money that they need for it. Again, that's going to be taken up here. The theme on those is implementation. And this is kind of interesting because Brazil has really said that, like, we want this to be the implementation COP. So it's interesting that we're looking at some of these like issues that never fully got realized, and now they're coming back and they're saying, like, now's the time to figure out how to fully implement this.
I think it'll be very interesting to see how effective the Brazil presidency is with that, because that's always like my bone to pick with these conferences, that we come up with all these agreements, but when it comes to implementation, we're still talking about it 10 years down the line. And an interesting aspect on this is that the US is absent from the Bonn Climate Conference. I think that was kind of expected. Am I correct, Jessie?
Yeah, I don't think anybody's particularly surprised. The US already announced that it was pulling out of the Paris Agreement back in January, I think on Trump's first day in office. That doesn't mean they've pulled out of the UNFCCC, which is like the overarching process under which the Paris Agreement operates. But they did announce that they wouldn't be in Bonn. But to be honest, I haven't really heard a whole lot about this. Like, I think it's become a bit of sort of an expected thing over the last several months, and the rest of the countries are just kind of getting on with it. I think there's potential for that to mean that, like, agreements are easier to come to, maybe. But I'm not really sure. Overall, it's just not really a big topic of conversation here.
The one thing we discussed, Ayenat, the last time we were on the podcast with Dave was, does the US exit make things easier? How does it affect their soft power, etc.? But I want to switch to the US, but to what's going on nationally. So we've been talking about the aid cuts for a very long time, but I think the conversation about how the aid cuts are actually affecting American farmers is now coming to the forefront. I've always wondered, how do you make the case for aid? And I felt like this American farmer component of it is actually a good thing, because aid does benefit American farmers. And for me, that's one of those that, okay, maybe this is one of those that makes America wealthier, or would it be a good thing? But what's the debate that's going on right now, and is it falling to listening ears?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that we're seeing a lot of politicians, including U.S. senators, really pushing, trying to push the narrative that foreign aid is really about protecting American interests and protecting American farmers as well as consumers. So I attended an event last week in Washington, D.C. with a bunch of Democratic senators, including Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota and Sheehan of New Hampshire. And they were really making this case that foreign aid is really about American farmers. And one stat that I learned a couple months ago and has always stuck with me is that if we considered foreign aid in terms of wheat as one distinct market, so, all American wheat that's donated is one market, it would be in the top 10 export markets for the United States for most years out of the past decade. So that's how large it is. It is one of the most important commercial markets for American wheat farmers. And it's something similar for many other crops. So this is hugely, hugely important. So this is something that we've seen these senators trying to emphasize in this forum that they held last week in Washington, D.C. It was only attended by Democrats, but this is a narrative that we know that a lot of Republicans are also in big support of. We know that Jerry Moran of Kansas, for example, is a very big advocate of American farmers and of American food aid as well. But it's also not just about American farmers, which was an interesting line of argument that I was hearing last week as well, is that because American food aid and the USDA also works on preventing diseases, livestock and crop diseases abroad. And so through agricultural research, through agricultural partnerships and the like, they're able to really help detect disease outbreaks and contain them before they spread to American shores. So this is something that helps us ensure that, things like African swine fever don't come here or exotic fruit flies don't come here. And ultimately, they were trying to make the case that this sort of investment helps protect American consumers and might even be helping protect us from the next pandemic. So this was also a narrative that was really starting to be pushed, which I thought was really interesting. One of the agency within the U.S. Department of Agriculture that's responsible for this is called APHIS. And the person who used to run APHIS, Kevin Shea, was one of the speakers at this D.C. forum last week. And he said something that I found to be quite alarming. And he said, he served the USDA for 45 years, and he had never been so concerned about the agency's ability to carry out its mission as he was today. And so this is someone who was in charge of ensuring that pathogens and diseases didn't spread around the world. So this is quite alarming for, half a century of experience at the agency. He's never been so concerned. So we'll see if that sort of narrative might kind of resonate more with regular American consumers. I mean, everyone has a vested interest in ensuring that there's not another pandemic, that, diseases aren't coming to our shores. And another narrative that we heard pushed, which I thought was quite compelling, was we heard from the former assistant administrator of the BHA, Sarah Charles, who had said, one other element, this isn't strictly food, but kind of humanitarian response in general, was that it really helped in opening up and strengthening diplomatic channels where we didn't have them before. And she pointed specifically to the U.S. responses in the Turkey-Syria earthquakes, as well as in Pakistan floods. And she was saying how, the United States' quick responses had helped open up those diplomatic channels. And so I thought that was a pretty compelling argument. So we're seeing the Democratic senators that organize this really trying a few different strategies to try and see what might resonate with American voters and American lawmakers. So, hopefully we'll see if any of those actually end up sticking.
I found is when you look at like the budget and the recession package, in terms of health, the thing that seems to have survived is infectious disease programs. So basically they're saying we need to keep America safe, so we need to be involved in infectious disease surveillance and responses abroad because of that. But one thing that people often ignore is the agricultural aspect of it and the One Health aspect of it, that an agricultural disease could also now spread to humans, and it also affects like humans as consumers as well. So I find that argument interesting, and it will be interesting to see if that will cross over to the agriculture space as well. But Jessie, the next thing that you're just like conference to conference is financing for development. And we have a story out today, actually, from Column, which states that the US will not be attending the Financing for Development conference. A lot of people, and we've been discussing this, say that in some cases it might be easier not to have the US there. But can you take us through what the US bonds of contention are with the Financing for Development agreement and why they've decided to pull out?
Yes. So yeah, Colin wrote a fantastic story a couple days ago on before the US had pulled out on sort of all the red lines that the US put in the document. And so we know from that what its issues are. But then obviously last night they pulled out entirely. And now, perhaps things will move forward a little bit more smoothly. We're not really sure. But some of those bones of contention, Colm said that there were 400 proposed amendments to a draft document. I'm obviously not going to go through all of them, but some of the main themes were any reference to the Sustainable Development Goals, replacing them with responsible development goals. So kind of removing the sustainability aspect of this. And really in line with that, removing commitments on climate action and phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies. So, I mean, this is to be expected. We know that this administration is not a fan of any references to climate. But of course, when you look at a document that is going to set the norms for development for the next 10 years, climate change is typically going to be a part of that now. Another is a big topic is on debt relief. So a lot of low and middle income countries are asking for an alternative to how debt restructuring works right now. They feel that it takes too long. It's a very opaque process and it doesn't really work. They also want more debt forgiveness. But the U.S. has really said, we're not interested in eliminating calls for debt relief. And they tried to weaken any provisions for sovereign debt restructuring. So that would be kind of putting the restructuring process in a different body, ideally a UN body, where low and middle income countries would have an equal say in how that process went. The U.S. also rejected any reference to gender rights. That's another thing that I think we could all expect. And they opposed multilateral tax cooperation, including a UN-backed proposal for a global tax treaty, which is something that actually came up back in FFD3 in Addis Ababa in 2015. That's when low and middle income countries really wanted a new treaty on taxes, and they also wanted it to be housed within the UN. It didn't work out, and they've spent the last 10 years kind of finding other ways to push that through. And now they're hoping that it will kind of be approved within FFD4. But the US didn't want that either. So those are just kind of some of the big points. And the US said that, I think the quote was that this text crossed too many of their red lines. And so they couldn't participate, which, it's hard to know exactly what this means. Obviously, it's a bummer to not have this global power in the discussions, but it also meant that the broader UN membership could come to an agreement on this text. So ultimately, it did end with a text that will be brought to Spain in I think just under 2 weeks now.
But the text, I think a lot of low-income countries are saying the text doesn't go far enough, but it's better than having nothing. So what I'm finding with a lot of these agreements, and I also saw this with like the pandemic agreement, is that there's actually a divide between high-income countries and low and middle-income countries. So even if you remove the US from it, high-income countries still have like some of the same claims that the US had, but maybe not as many, maybe not 400 amendments, but they still have like the same claims. So what are some of the contentions, the strong contentions, and some of the divisions that you're seeing?
Yeah, that's very true. So even before the U.S. pulled out, there was a big group of developed countries that wanted to the main one is debt. They wanted to remove like this entire paragraph on debt and debt restructuring, as I mentioned before. There were also some issues on climate, although I think there are several developed countries that wanted to keep climate stuff in, including Poland, actually. But yeah, on debt, like the EU and the UK and Japan, they were all saying like we don't want to change how debt is restructured right now. A lot of them have been saying like we're going to improve what we currently have, which is called the G20 global common framework. Excuse me. And we're going to make it faster. It's already getting faster. Let's just keep this here. rather than create a whole new body for it, and rather than kind of just like forgive all this debt. But the complaint from low and middle income countries is that this is mainly OECD countries that are controlling the common framework. So they don't really get a fair say on how this should be done or what they need or how information is shared. And that's what they're really having an issue with. Ultimately, I think the outcome on debt was a softening of the language. I think they said that they, rather than kind of fully closing some of the gaps in the debt architecture, the language changed to making recommendations for closing gaps in the debt architecture. So it's still in there, but obviously much softer. It doesn't commit anyone to anything. I think it's important to note in general, these documents aren't legally binding. Like I said earlier, this is a norm setting conference. But if you're just making recommendations, you're not necessarily taking action. So I think that's where the trade-off has landed.
But I feel a lot of people are talking about financing for development, and I think I probably understand why, because of the moments that we're in right now. But how important is this conference, and what impact can it actually have?
That's a really hard question to answer. And then when I started kind of trying to cover this, I asked the same question, like, what does this lead to? You know, at something like COP that we have every year, we come out with a document. A number is often on that document that everybody has to commit to. FFT is really different in that way because it's not legally binding and it's not super specific. It is an agreement among the world's powers to prioritize certain things in the development landscape for the next decade. So this is the fourth one, which should be obvious that we've only had 3 others and so like it is important as like, okay, we've all agreed that climate is important. We've all agreed that debt is important. We all have now agreed that these are the things that we're going to prioritize over the next 10 years. And I think that really does have quite an impact on what kinds of conversations can be had on the global landscape.
Okay. So I'm assuming, Jessie, what we need to look out for you from in the coming weeks is what's happening at Bonn and what's going to happen at Financing for Development. Ayenat, what can we be on the lookout for on the U.S. front for the next coming weeks?
So in the U.S. front, related to food, there will be there is a bill that is in front of Congress right now, appropriations bill. So it's kind of how it works. Basically, the House usually comes out with its own appropriations package saying this is how much we should spend on various programs. The Senate will come out with a similar one. And then ideally, through some alchemy, they will come to an agreement. Although I think, as many listeners know, the budget and spending in the United States government has not been the easiest process for, many years, not just, in recent times. So we're not exactly sure when we can expect a new firm budget when it comes to what we can expect out of food spending. But one thing that we're really watching quite closely is where some of these USAID food programs end up landing. We're expecting that to land at USDA, and it seems pretty likely that will happen. We're just not exactly sure when that will happen or how exactly it will happen, and it will almost certainly be pared down. And so another big question will be by how much it will be pared down. But we're just going to keep an eye out. It's a little bit in flux and hard to answer exactly when we can expect those answers, but that's something that we'll be watching out for. Where will the food aid land? How much will it be? And what are the processes through which that transfer will happen? So we'll definitely keep you posted.
Thank you so much. And thank you both for joining me. And we'll definitely be covering all these issues. And if you do want to follow us, make sure you sign up for Devex Newswire, where you can find all these stories and more. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.